November 1902. Sheriff Arthur Hayes wasn't investigating a family when he knocked on the door of the Ashford farmhouse. He was investigating a rumor about stolen livestock. But when the door opened, what he saw made him forget the cattle entirely. 4 women, all in their 20s and 30s, stood shoulder to shoulder in the dim doorway. Sisters. Behind them, emerging from the darkness of the cabin, came a man in his late 50s, their father, Jeremiah Ashford. The women moved in unison, their eyes locked not on the sheriff but on their father's face, waiting for permission to speak. Hayes noticed something else. 3 of the 4 women were visibly pregnant. And in that moment, standing in the mud of rural Stone County, Missouri, Sheriff Hayes understood he'd stumbled into something far darker than cattle theft. This is the story of the Ashford family. 4 sisters who married their own father, bore his children, and built a compound of horror hidden in the Ozark Hollows for nearly 2 decades. It's a story about how isolation, religious delusion, and absolute patriarchal control created a nightmare that even hardened investigators struggled to comprehend. Subscribe now to stand with us as we uncover the histories they tried to bury, and drop your location in the comments so we know where these dark truths are reaching. How did this happen? How did 4 daughters become their father's wives? And why did it take 20 years for anyone to stop it? The Ashford family had once been unremarkable. Jeremiah Ashford, born in 1847, was a farmer, a veteran of minor Confederate skirmishes, and by all accounts, an ordinary man. He married Rebecca Thornton in 1871. Together they had 6 children, 4 daughters: Martha, born 1872, Sarah 1874, Elizabeth 1876, and Ruth 1879, and 2 sons who died in infancy. For the first decade, neighbors in Stone County remembered them as quiet, hard-working, devout. Jeremiah attended church irregularly but spoke often of Scripture. Rebecca kept the household. The girls were homeschooled, as was common in those isolated hills. But by 1902, the Ashford family had become something else entirely. The daughters, now women aged 23 to 30, no longer left the property. They wore identical dresses sewn from the same fabric. When travelers passed the farm, they reported seeing the sisters working in perfect synchronization, planting, harvesting, laundering, always together, always silent. And Jeremiah? He ruled the farm with a presence so absolute that even the livestock seemed to sense it. To understand how Jeremiah became capable of what he did, you have to go back 1 generation further, to his father, Ezekiel Ashford. Ezekiel was a circuit preacher who traveled the Ozark Hills in the 1830s and 1840s, spreading a theology that was already considered radical by his peers. He preached about purity of bloodlines. He preached that the corruption of the modern world could only be resisted by families who kept their lineage clean and undiluted by outsiders. He kept journals, dense rambling manuscripts filled with biblical citations twisted into justifications for isolation. One entry, dated 1843, reads, "The world has fallen. Only the pure shall inherit. And purity begins in the family, where blood knows blood, where loyalty is born, not chosen." Ezekiel's obsession was genealogical purity. He believed that intermarriage with outsiders weakened not just families, but souls. Where did this obsession come from? Historians suggest Ezekiel may have been influenced by isolated sects that emerged in Appalachia and the Ozarks during the Second Great Awakening, movements that conflated biblical literalism with fear of cultural change. But whatever its source, Ezekiel's theology became the foundation of the Ashford family worldview, and he passed it directly to his son. Jeremiah Ashford absorbed his father's teachings, but he went further. Where Ezekiel preached isolation, Jeremiah practiced it. Where Ezekiel theorized about purity, Jeremiah made it doctrine. In 1881, when Jeremiah was 34, he attended a traveling preacher's revival where he heard a sermon about Abraham and Sarah, a sermon that emphasized Abraham's absolute authority over his household, his willingness to sacrifice his son, his direct relationship with God that bypassed all earthly authority. Jeremiah returned home changed. He began keeping his own journals, and in them he developed what he called his gospel of the household, the core belief that a father was not just the head of his family, he was the priest, the prophet, and the sole conduit between his family and God. One entry from 1883 reads, "A man's daughters are his flock. The world will corrupt them. Schools will poison them. Other men will defile them. Only their Father can preserve them pure." By 1885, Jeremiah had stopped attending church. He'd stopped allowing his daughters to socialize with other families. He'd begun homeschooling them not just in reading and writing, but in his theology. He taught them that the outside world was fallen. He taught them that marriage to outsiders was spiritual death. He taught them that their purpose was to serve, obey, and preserve the family's purity. And by 1887, he'd convinced them that their father was the only man worthy of their devotion. Rebecca Ashford died in August 1889. The official cause of death was listed as consumption, tuberculosis. She was 38 years old, but neighbors who attended her funeral noticed something strange. Rebecca's daughters showed no grief. They stood silent, expressionless, as their mother was buried. And Jeremiah? He didn't weep. He didn't speak. He simply watched. After Rebecca's death, the last external voice of reason was gone. Within 6 months, Jeremiah stopped allowing visitors to the property. He stopped selling crops in town, relying instead on what the family could grow and preserve. He stopped acknowledging the existence of civil authority. And by 1891, according to later testimony from the daughters, Jeremiah had begun marrying them, one by one. In private ceremonies he conducted himself. Martha first in 1891 when she was 19, Sarah in 1893 at 19, Elizabeth in 1894 at 18, Ruth in 1897 at 18. There were no legal marriages, no witnesses, no certificates. Only Jeremiah's word, which he told his daughters was the only word that mattered. The theology that had started with Ezekiel's obsession with purity had metastasized into something unspeakable. A father who believed he owned not just his daughters' labor, but their bodies, their futures, and their souls. How did this happen in plain sight? The answer lies in the geography and culture of the Ozarks at the turn of the century. The Ashford farm sat in a hollow 8 miles from the nearest town. Roads were little more than wagon trails. In winter, the property was inaccessible for weeks at a time. Communication infrastructure didn't exist. No telephones, no telegraph lines reaching that far into the hills. But more than geography, there was culture. The Ozarks in 1890-1910 were populated by families who'd fled Reconstruction, industrial expansion, and government oversight. Mind your own business wasn't neighborly advice. It was survival. Families who reported on other families were ostracized, sometimes violently. And religious eccentricity? That was common. Circuit preachers, self-appointed prophets, and isolated sects dotted the region. Jeremiah's theology wasn't unusual enough to raise alarms. It was just one more version of mountain spirituality that outsiders didn't understand and locals didn't question. So when the Ashford daughters stopped coming to town, people assumed they'd simply married and moved away. When Jeremiah stopped appearing at church, people assumed he'd found a different congregation. No one investigated. No one checked. No one wanted to know. And that silence gave Jeremiah Ashford 20 years to build his kingdom of horror. Thomas Whitmore was a traveling peddler who sold dry goods, tools, and seeds throughout Stone County. His routes took him to the most isolated homesteads, and in the spring of 1897, he added the Ashford farm to his circuit. His first visit seemed normal. Jeremiah met him at the property line and purchased nails, flour, and fabric. Whitmore noticed the daughters in the distance working in the garden. They didn't approach. They didn't wave. But that wasn't unusual. Modesty and caution were common among isolated families. Whitmore returned 3 months later in July 1897. This time he noticed something different. One of the daughters, he later identified her as Sarah, was visibly pregnant. Whitmore congratulated Jeremiah, assuming one of the daughters had married. Jeremiah said nothing. He simply stared until Whitmore stopped talking. Whitmore also noticed that the sisters worked with a precision that seemed rehearsed. They moved in unison, planting rows of corn with identical movements, never speaking, never looking up. It bothered him, but he couldn't say why. On his third visit, in October 1897, Whitmore arrived unannounced. Jeremiah wasn't at the property line to meet him. So Whitmore walked closer to the cabin. He heard something that made him stop. A woman's voice, low, trembling, was reciting scripture. But it wasn't prayer. It sounded like memorization under threat. When Jeremiah emerged from the cabin, his expression was cold. "We didn't call for you," he said. Whitmore left immediately. On his fourth visit, in March 1898, Whitmore saw two of the daughters, both pregnant. He asked Jeremiah directly, "How many sons-in-law do you have?" Jeremiah smiled. "My daughters are married to the man who matters." Whitmore didn't ask what that meant, but he didn't need to. The phrase, and the way Jeremiah said it, stayed with him for years. At the general store in town, the merchant, a man named Edwin Carter, kept ledgers of purchases. In 1899, he began noticing a pattern in Jeremiah's orders. Fabric. Lots of fabric. Always the same color, drab gray. Always the same quantity, enough for 4 identical dresses. Nails and lumber, enough to build multiple small structures. Chains. Heavy iron chains purchased 3 separate times between 1897 and 1900. When Carter asked what the chains were for, Jeremiah said, "Securing property." Carter noted it in his ledger, but never reported it. Chains were chains. People bought them for livestock, for gates, for 100 reasons. He had no reason to think they were being used on people. But later, when investigators reviewed those ledgers, the purchases would tell a story Carter had missed. In the town of Galena, 8 miles from the Ashford farm, gossip spread quietly. A midwife named Clara Johnston told her husband that she'd been called to the Ashford property once in 1895 to assist with a birth. When she arrived, Jeremiah refused to let her inside. He said the baby had already been born. Clara never saw the mother. She never saw the child. A hunter named Samuel Brooks reported seeing the Ashford daughters working in the fields late at night, by lantern light, in the middle of winter. Didn't make sense, he said. Wasn't planting season, wasn't harvest. They were just digging. A traveling preacher named Reverend Amos Clay visited the Ashford property in 1900, hoping to bring Jeremiah back to church. Jeremiah met him at the property line with a shotgun and told him to leave. Clay later told his congregation, "That man believes he is the church." But none of this was reported to authorities. In the Ozarks of 1900, you didn't report on your neighbors. You talked, you gossiped, you knew, but you didn't act. And that silence allowed the horror to continue. In 1901, a surveyor named Martin Cross was mapping property lines for the county. His route took him near the Ashford farm. When he approached the property, he was met by all 4 daughters, standing in a line blocking the path. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They simply stared. Cross tried to explain his purpose. The daughters didn't respond. After 10 minutes, Cross turned around and left. He later told a colleague, "I've seen guard dogs with more personality." Another traveler, a cattle buyer named James Pruitt, stopped at the Ashford property in 1902, hoping to purchase livestock. He saw Jeremiah standing in the doorway of the cabin, arms crossed while his daughters worked in the field. Pruitt called out a greeting. Jeremiah didn't respond. The daughters didn't look up. Pruitt left without making a purchase. He later said, "Felt like walking into a graveyard." These near misses, these moments where outsiders glimpsed the strangeness of the Ashford household, accumulated over the years. But they never cohered into action. They remained fragments of discomfort, whispered in taverns and general stores but never formalized into reports. Until Sheriff Arthur Hayes knocked on that door in November 1902. Martha Ashford was born in 1872. She was the first daughter, the first to be homeschooled by her father, the first to be shaped by his theology. By the time she was 10, Martha could recite entire chapters of scripture from memory. By 15, she was teaching her younger sisters. By 18, she'd never spoken to a boy her own age. When her mother died in 1889, Martha was 17. She became the surrogate mother to her sisters, cooking, cleaning, managing the household. She was responsible, obedient, devoted. And in 1891, when Jeremiah told her that God had revealed to him that she was to become his spiritual wife, Martha didn't resist. Later, in her testimony to authorities, Martha would say, "I didn't know I could say no. He was my father. He was my priest. He said it was God's will." How could I refuse God? Martha bore her first child, a daughter, in 1892. The child died within a year, cause unknown. She bore a second child in 1894. That child also died in infancy. By 1902, Martha had been pregnant 6 times. Only 2 of her children survived past age 5. She was 30 years old. Her body was worn. Her eyes were empty. And she still called Jeremiah father, even as she called him husband. Sarah was born in 1874. Of the 4 sisters, she was the most devout, the one who believed most fully in her father's theology. In her later testimony, Sarah described her father as chosen by God. She said she was honored to be his wife. She said the outside world was fallen and that her family was pure. Even after her father's arrest, even after the evidence of abuse was undeniable, Sarah maintained that she had acted willingly. She insisted that she loved him. Psychologists who later examined the case noted that Sarah exhibited classic symptoms of what would now be called Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological condition where captives develop loyalty to their captors as a survival mechanism. But in 1902, there was no term for what Sarah had experienced. There was only the fact of her devotion and the tragedy of a woman so completely controlled that she couldn't recognize her own victimization. Sarah bore 3 children between 1895 and 1902. All 3 survived, though they suffered from developmental delays and health issues consistent with inbreeding. Elizabeth, born in 1876, was described by investigators as nearly mute. She spoke only when directly questioned. She avoided eye contact. When Sheriff Hayes first interviewed her, she answered every question with the same phrase, "Father knows best." Later testimony revealed that Elizabeth had tried to resist. In 1893, when she was 17, she told her mother she wanted to leave the farm. Rebecca, weakened by tuberculosis and under Jeremiah's control, told her daughter there was nowhere to go. Elizabeth tried to run away once. She made it 3 miles before Jeremiah found her. What happened when he brought her back was never fully documented, but neighbors reported hearing screams from the Ashford property that night. After that, Elizabeth never spoke of leaving again. She bore her first child in 1896. The child was stillborn. She bore a second in 1898. That child lived but suffered from severe physical deformities. By 1902, Elizabeth was pregnant again and visibly malnourished. Ruth was born in 1879. She was only 10 when her mother died. She was only 12 when her eldest sister Martha became their father's wife. Ruth grew up watching her sisters disappear into their father's control. By the time she turned 18 in 1897, she knew what was coming. In later testimony, Ruth would describe a moment in 1897 when Jeremiah sat her down and explained that she was now of age to fulfill her spiritual duty. She asked if she had a choice. He told her that choice was an illusion created by the devil to tempt people away from God's will. Ruth bore her first child in 1899 at age 20. The child died within weeks. She bore a second in 1901. That child survived. Of the 4 sisters, Ruth was the one who would eventually provide the most detailed testimony to authorities. Not because she wanted to betray her father, but because by 1902, she was too exhausted to lie anymore. But wait, didn't these women have other family? Didn't anyone notice they'd vanished from society? The answer is complicated by the culture of the time. In rural Missouri in the 1890s, daughters didn't vanish. They simply married and stayed home. It was normal for young women to never leave their family property. It was normal for them to be homeschooled, to avoid social events, to remain under their father's authority until marriage, and even after. Jeremiah told anyone who asked that his daughters had married and were living on the family land with their husbands. He was vague about who these husbands were, but vagueness wasn't suspicious. It was privacy. And Rebecca's side of the family? Her parents were dead by 1890. Her siblings lived in Arkansas and had lost contact with her after her marriage. By the time they might have wondered about their nieces, those nieces had already been subsumed into Jeremiah's world. So there were no search parties, no missing person reports, no alarm bells, just 4 women disappearing in plain sight. How do we know the details of these women's lives? We know because after their father's arrest, each sister was interviewed separately by investigators. Their testimonies, recorded in county court documents, provide the most detailed picture we have. We know because a local doctor, Dr. Nathaniel Perkins, examined the sisters after their rescue and documented their physical condition: malnutrition, signs of repeated pregnancies and miscarriages, psychological trauma. We know because the children who survived, 5 in total by 1902, were examined and their medical records preserved. Those records document developmental delays, physical deformities, and health issues consistent with inbreeding. And we know because one of the sisters, Ruth, kept a hidden diary, written in tiny script on scraps of paper and hidden in a crack in the cabin wall. That diary, recovered by authorities, describes years of isolation, control, and abuse in heartbreaking detail. These women were not statistics. They were people with names, dreams, and futures that were stolen from them. And their stories matter. Sheriff Arthur Hayes was 34 years old in 1902. He'd been elected sheriff of Stone County 2 years earlier on a platform of law and order. He was educated, methodical, and unlike many rural sheriffs of his era, he believed in documentation. In November 1902, Hayes received a complaint from a neighboring farmer named Jacob Wilkes, who claimed Jeremiah Ashford had stolen 3 head of cattle. Wilkes had no proof, but he insisted Hayes investigate. Hayes rode out to the Ashford property on November 12, 1902. He arrived mid-morning. When he knocked on the door, he expected to speak to a farmer about missing livestock. Instead, he met 4 women who looked like ghosts. They stood in the doorway, identical in dress and posture. Their eyes were hollow, their skin was pale, and behind them stood Jeremiah Ashford, silent, watchful, in complete control. Hayes asked about the cattle. Jeremiah denied taking them, but Hayes wasn't focused on the cattle anymore. He was focused on the women. "These your daughters?" Hayes asked. "They are," Jeremiah said. "They married?" "They are." "Where are their husbands?" Jeremiah smiled. "You're looking at him." Hayes later testified that in that moment, he knew something was deeply wrong. But knowing and proving are different things. He asked to see the marriage certificates. Jeremiah refused, saying they weren't civil marriages but spiritual unions that required no documentation. Hayes asked to speak to the daughters privately. Jeremiah refused, saying his wives had nothing to hide and nothing to say without his permission. Hayes documented everything. He noted the daughters' identical clothing, their lack of speech without Jeremiah's permission, the fact that 3 of the 4 were visibly pregnant, the unusual smell coming from inside the cabin, a mixture of smoke, sweat, and something else he couldn't identify. The chains hanging from hooks on the cabin's exterior wall. Hayes had no legal authority to enter the property without a warrant, but he left determined to get one. Over the next 3 weeks, Hayes began building a case. He interviewed Thomas Whitmore, the peddler, who confirmed years of strange observations. He reviewed Edwin Carter's ledgers and noted the pattern of purchases. He spoke to Clara Johnston, the midwife, who described being turned away from a birth. He sent telegrams to the county prosecutor and to the Missouri State Attorney General's office, requesting guidance. The responses were slow. Incest wasn't technically illegal in Missouri in 1902. It was considered a moral failing, not a criminal act. But child abuse, unlawful imprisonment, and rape were. The challenge was evidence. Hayes needed proof that the daughters were being held against their will. He needed testimony from the women themselves, and he needed a legal justification to enter the property. In late November 1902, Hayes got his break. On November 28, 1902, a neighbor, Samuel Brooks the hunter, approached Hayes with new information. Brooks had been checking his traps near the Ashford property when he heard crying. Not adult crying, infant crying, coming from somewhere beneath the ground. Brooks had investigated and discovered a small cellar structure about 50 yards from the main cabin. The door was locked with a chain. The crying came from inside. Brooks didn't open the door. He didn't want to trespass, but he reported it immediately. Hayes now had probable cause. If children were being held in a locked cellar, that was unlawful imprisonment. That was enough for a warrant. On December 2, 1902, Hayes obtained a warrant from the county judge. He assembled a team of 4 deputies, and at dawn on December 3rd, They rode to the Ashford property. They were prepared for resistance. They weren't prepared for what they found. December 3rd, 1902. Dawn came late to the Ozark Hollows. Sheriff Hayes and his deputies approached the Ashford property quietly, on foot, leading their horses behind them. They saw smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. They saw the four sisters already at work in the field despite the cold. And they saw Jeremiah standing on the porch, arms crossed, watching them approach. Hayes identified himself and presented the warrant. Jeremiah didn't resist. He simply stepped aside and said, "You'll find nothing but God's work here." The deputies entered the cabin first. What they saw was a single-room structure, spartanly furnished. One large bed, a table, a fireplace, and a crude altar covered in scripture verses written on paper and nailed to the wall. The daughters followed the deputies inside, silent, expressionless. When Hayes asked if they were being held against their will, all four said, "No." But Hayes wasn't there for the cabin. He was there for the cellar. 50 yards from the main cabin, Hayes and his deputies found the structure Samuel Brooks had described. A small wooden shed built over a cellar entrance. The door was padlocked. Heavy chains secured it. Hayes demanded the key. Jeremiah refused. Hayes ordered his deputies to break the lock. Inside they found two children, both girls ages approximately 3 and 4. They were malnourished, filthy, and terrified. They cowered in the corner when the deputies approached. Hayes asked Jeremiah why the children were locked in a cellar. Jeremiah responded calmly, "They're being disciplined. Discipline is love." The children were removed immediately. A deputy carried them back to the cabin, where Dr. Nathaniel Perkins, who'd accompanied the raiding party, began examining them. But the cellar revealed more. In the earthen floor, Hayes found something that turned his stomach. Small graves, unmarked, shallow. He ordered his deputies to excavate. Over the next 6 hours, deputies excavated the area around the cellar. They found the remains of at least 8 infants and small children. Some were buried in crude wooden boxes. Others were wrapped in fabric. One was buried in what appeared to be a flour sack. Dr. Perkins examined the remains and estimated they ranged in age from newborn to approximately 2 years old. Cause of death was impossible to determine due to decomposition, but Perkins noted that none of the remains showed signs of violent trauma. He speculated that the children had died of neglect, malnutrition, or illness, and had been buried in secret. When Hayes confronted Jeremiah's response was chilling in its matter-of-factness. "Not all children are chosen by God. The weak are returned to the earth. It's not murder. It's mercy." Hayes arrested Jeremiah immediately. The 4 daughters were taken into protective custody. The surviving children, 5 in total ranging in age from 8 months to 7 years, were removed from the property and placed with temporary guardians. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, the 4 Ashford sisters exhibited a range of reactions. None of them what investigators expected. Martha, the eldest, was silent. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply sat on a bench in the county jail's waiting area, staring at her hands. Sarah, the devout one, insisted that the authorities had made a mistake. She demanded to be returned to her father. She called Hayes a servant of Satan. Elizabeth, the silent one, remained silent. When asked direct questions, she didn't respond. She didn't seem to register that anything had changed. Ruth, the youngest, was the only one who showed visible emotion. She cried. She asked, over and over, "What happens now?" None of the sisters asked about their children. None asked about the graves. None expressed relief. And that absence, that inability to recognize their own rescue, was perhaps the most heartbreaking evidence of the psychological control Jeremiah had exerted for 2 decades. Dr. Nathaniel Perkins conducted full medical examinations of all 4 sisters. His reports, preserved in county court records, are clinical and devastating. Martha: evidence of at least 6 pregnancies, severe malnutrition, signs of old fractures in her ribs and left wrist that had healed improperly, suggesting previous physical trauma. Sarah: evidence of at least 4 pregnancies, chronic anemia, significant dental decay due to nutritional deficiencies. Elizabeth: evidence of at least 3 pregnancies, signs of prolonged psychological trauma, including what Perkins described as hysterical numbness. Ruth. Evidence of at least 2 pregnancies. The youngest sister, but already showing physical deterioration, consistent with repeated childbearing and inadequate recovery. Perkins also examined the 5 surviving children. All showed signs of developmental delays. 2 had physical deformities. 1 child had a cleft palate, another had clubfoot. Perkins noted in his report, "These conditions are consistent with consanguineous reproduction, inbreeding. The genetic consequences of incestuous unions are well documented. These children are living evidence." While deputies were processing the physical evidence, Sheriff Hayes conducted a thorough search of the cabin. In a wooden trunk beneath Jeremiah's bed, he found journals dating back to 1885. 17 years of theological justifications, daily routines, and disturbingly detailed records of his marriages to his daughters. One entry from 1891 reads, "Martha is now my wife in the eyes of God. The civil authorities would not understand. They are blind to divine truth, but I am not bound by man's law. I am bound by God's will, and God has revealed to me that my bloodline is sacred." Another, from 1897. "Ruth questioned me today. She asked why her sister's husbands never visit. I explained that there are no other husbands. There is only me. She cried, but tears are a form of rebellion. I will pray over her until she understands." And one final entry, from November 1902, just days before Hayes's raid. "The sheriff came today. He suspects. But suspicion is not proof. And even if they take me, my daughters will remain faithful. I have built their faith brick by brick. It cannot be dismantled by the world." These journals would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The surviving children were too young to testify in court, but Dr. Perkins and a local school teacher named Margaret Flynn interviewed them and documented their statements. One child, a 7-year-old girl named Mary, daughter of Martha, said, "Papa is the only man. Mama says Papa is God's voice." Another child, a 5-year-old boy named Samuel, son of Sarah, said, "We don't go outside. Outside is bad, Papa says." The youngest child, an 8-month-old infant, was too young to speak, but his existence, born to Ruth in early 1902, was itself evidence of ongoing abuse. The children's statements, combined with the medical evidence and Jeremiah's own journals, created an undeniable portrait of a man who had systematically controlled, abused, and exploited his daughters for nearly 20 years. In December 1902, a forensic specialist from Kansas City, Dr. Leonard Shaw, traveled to Stone County to examine the infant remains recovered from the Ashford property. Shaw's report concluded that at least 8 infants had been buried on the property. Due to decomposition, precise cause of death could not be determined, but Shaw noted, "The absence of trauma suggests these infants died of natural causes, likely malnutrition, illness, or complications from inbreeding. However, the manner of burial, secretive, unmarked, and in proximity to a disciplinary cellar, suggests deliberate concealment. This is not the behavior of a grieving family. This is the behavior of a family hiding something." Shaw also examined the 2 surviving children who'd been found in the cellar. Both showed signs of prolonged confinement, vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight, muscle atrophy, and psychological trauma. Shaw's conclusion: these children were not being disciplined, they were being imprisoned. As investigators pieced together testimony from the sisters, a pattern emerged, a pattern of absolute methodical control. Jeremiah controlled every aspect of his daughters' lives. He dictated what they wore, identical gray dresses. He dictated when they ate, slept, and worked. He dictated which scripture verses they memorized and recited daily. He controlled their pregnancies, deciding which children were worthy of survival and which were returned to the earth. He controlled their speech, forbidding them from speaking to outsiders without his permission. He controlled their understanding of reality, convincing them that the outside world was evil and that he alone was their protector. This wasn't merely abuse. It was totalitarian psychological control, what modern psychologists would recognize as coercive control, a pattern of behavior designed to isolate, dominate, and exploit. And it had worked for 2 decades. When Jeremiah was formally interrogated by prosecutors in January 1903, he showed no remorse. He showed no recognition that he'd committed crimes. Instead, he offered theological justifications for every action. On marrying his daughters, marriage is a covenant before God, not the state. I married them in the eyes of God. The state has no authority over divine unions. On the infant graves, God decides who lives. I simply obey. The weak are returned. The strong survive. This is scripture. On the cellar imprisonment, discipline is love. Solomon wrote, "He who spares the rod hates his son. I do not hate my children. I love them enough to correct them." Prosecutors noted that Jeremiah spoke with absolute certainty. He wasn't lying. He wasn't performing. He genuinely believed every word he said, and that made him even more dangerous. Jeremiah Ashford's trial began in March 1903 in the Stone County Courthouse. It lasted 2 weeks and became a media sensation. Newspapers from St. Louis, Kansas City, and even Chicago sent reporters. Headlines screamed, "Father weds own daughters," "Ozark horror unveiled," "Incest farm discovered." The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Jeremiah's journals documenting his marriages, medical testimony confirming inbreeding, and abuse testimony from the sisters themselves. Though limited, Sarah refused to testify. Martha spoke only in single-word answers, and Elizabeth remained silent. Testimony from neighbors, the peddler, and the midwife. Forensic evidence from the infant graves. The defense assigned by the court. Jeremiah refused to participate in his own defense, calling the trial illegitimate, argued that Jeremiah was insane and should be committed to an asylum rather than imprisoned. But the jury wasn't convinced. After 4 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict. Guilty on 9 counts of incest, 4 counts of unlawful imprisonment, and 8 counts of criminal negligence resulting in death. Missouri law in 1903 didn't have a specific legal framework for incest as a crime, so prosecutors had relied on statutes related to abuse, imprisonment, and neglect. But the verdict was clear. Jeremiah Ashford was a criminal, not a prophet. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The aftermath for the Ashford sisters was complicated and heartbreaking. Martha, the eldest, was placed in the care of a distant cousin in Arkansas. She never spoke publicly about her experience. She never married. She died in 1931 at age 59 in a state-run facility for women with nervous disorders. Sarah, the devout one, refused to acknowledge that her father had done anything wrong. She maintained contact with him through letters until his death in 1921. She never recovered psychologically. She died in 1925 at age 51 after a lifelong battle with what doctors at the time called religious mania. Elizabeth, the silent one, was eventually placed in the care of a charitable organization in Kansas City. She learned to speak again, slowly, with therapy, but she never fully reintegrated into society. She worked as a seamstress and lived alone. She died in 1941 at age 65. Ruth, the youngest, provided the most detailed testimony and was the only sister who openly acknowledged the abuse. She was placed with a foster family and eventually married a local farmer in 1910. She had 3 children, none with health issues related to inbreeding. She lived until 1956, dying at age 77. In interviews late in her life, Ruth said, "I survived, but part of me never left that farm." The 5 surviving children were adopted by different families across Missouri. Their identities were changed to protect them from stigma. One child, Mary, Martha's daughter, later became a school teacher and lived a relatively normal life. The others' fates are less well documented, but records suggest most struggled with health and psychological issues throughout their lives. Jeremiah Ashford was incarcerated at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. He remained defiant until his death. He refused to work. He refused to attend religious services. He spent his days writing new journals, theological treatises that became increasingly incoherent. In 1915, prison officials noted that Jeremiah had begun speaking to himself, believing he was in direct communication with God. He was transferred to the prison's psychiatric wing, where he spent the final 6 years of his life. He died in 1921 at age 74 of pneumonia. His final recorded words, spoken to a prison chaplain, were, "I did nothing wrong. History will vindicate me." History did not. The children born from Jeremiah's incestuous unions lived with the consequences for the rest of their lives. The physical consequences were immediate: developmental delays, health issues, higher rates of illness. But the psychological consequences were deeper. Mary, the eldest surviving child, later wrote, in a private letter discovered by historians, "I didn't understand until I was 12 that what happened to my mother wasn't normal. I didn't understand that other families didn't live like we did. When I finally learned the truth, I felt like my entire childhood had been a lie." Samuel, another surviving child, struggled with identity throughout his life. He changed his name twice, attempting to escape the stigma of the Ashford name. He died in 1967, having never spoken publicly about his origins. The youngest child, born in 1902, was adopted by a family in Illinois who never told him about his biological origins. He lived his entire life unaware of the circumstances of his birth. Historians argue that this was perhaps the greatest mercy he received. These children were innocent victims of their grandfather's madness, and their lives were shaped by trauma they didn't choose and couldn't escape. The Ashford case became a turning point in American legal and social history. It exposed the dangers of extreme isolation, the ease with which patriarchal authority could become tyranny, and the failure of communities to intervene when suspicion arose. In the wake of the case, Missouri passed the first state laws explicitly criminalizing incest, 1905, and expanded definitions of child abuse to include psychological control, 1907. The case also influenced the early social work movement. Organizations like the Children's Aid Society and the National Child Welfare League cited the Ashford case as evidence that isolated families needed monitoring and support. Culturally, the case became a cautionary tale about religious extremism. Theologians and clergy across denominations used the Ashford case to argue for institutional oversight of religious teaching, fearing that isolated, self-appointed prophets could twist scripture into justifications for abuse. The case also entered American folklore. In the Ozarks, the phrase Ashford's daughters became shorthand for victims of family control. Even today, historians and sociologists studying family abuse, coercive control, and religious extremism cite the Ashford case as one of the most extreme examples on record. But perhaps the case's most important legacy is this: it forced a reckoning with the idea that privacy and autonomy are absolute goods. The Ashford case proved that sometimes silence enables horror, that sometimes communities must intervene, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it violates cultural norms of minding your own business, because the cost of silence was 4 women's lives, 8 children's deaths, and a legacy of trauma that echoed for generations. The Ashford family's story is not a story about one man's depravity. It's a story about systems that failed, a legal system that had no framework to recognize incest as a crime, a community that valued privacy over protection, and a culture that granted fathers near absolute authority over their families. It's a story about the power of isolation to enable horror, the power of ideology to justify the unjustifiable, and the power of one man's delusion to destroy multiple lives. But it's also a story about resilience, about Ruth, who survived and built a life, about the children who escaped and found new families, about Sheriff Arthur Hayes, who refused to look away even when looking away would have been easier. The victims of the Ashford family deserve to be remembered, not as statistics, not as footnotes, but as people. People with names, people with dreams, people whose lives mattered. If this story affected you, honor them by subscribing, by sharing, and by remembering that vigilance is not intrusion. Sometimes, intervention is love. Drop your location in the comments. Let us know where this story reached you, and remember, the past is never as far away as we think.